Hello, Robin Brown, various affiliations, Foundation for Effective Markets and Governance, one of them. On the question of active citizenship, is that your term, Scott? Or
yes.
Active citizens? What I'm interested in is the question of whether that is best tackled by trying to develop networks of leading citizens, if you like, leadership networks, or whether it's best to try a broader approach to develop demand for greater accountability in government across populations more widely. Maybe the approach is going to vary from country to country. I'm just thinking of Solomon Islands at the moment, and the difficulty of marrying the Wontok sort of system of the traditional system of governance there with the modern system that the nation as a whole is being supposedly run under. Do you have any thoughts? Do any others have any thoughts on where the emphasis should be placed on developing sort of key leadership networks, or a broader approach to develop a broad demand, like I think we do have in Australia, for good government? I mean, I think that's why we have relatively good government in Australia, because citizens fairly generally demand it.
If I can just respond from the government's perspective, I suppose it's not an either-or approach, and in fact you'll see a suite of initiatives that are part of our aid program, some of which are about developing capacity on the ground for people to actually participate. Some of them are very micro programs that may be about enabling women to actually meet and develop their own agendas. And at the same time, we are looking to strengthen institutional arrangements in these countries by actually investing in things like emerging leadership programs, or improving the decision making and educating emerging politicians, for example, new leaders in those countries. So it's not either or. You actually are finding various levels of entry point to tackle what is a very complex issue. But it is, as Kevin said, it is really about strengthening the institutional arrangements in the country, and that builds greater capability overall.
Scott, did you want to?
Yeah, in the way that you set it up, I'd be very inclined towards broad-based, inclusive social movements that allow people to secure their rights, rather than focusing on getting a few good leaders. So leadership can be fickle, but social movements can be very powerful. So if we think about issues of gender, ethnicity, what we could do is go to existing leadership and say, well, we really need you to be serious about gender. And that might be something that's worthwhile to do sometimes. But it's much better if we have an active social movement combating gender inequality that can hold governments to account. So it's a little bit of a broad brushstroke, but it's centrally important that people at all levels are able to be active in shaping the forces that will affect their deprivations, and that it be very inclusive. So taking account of not just inequalities between the most powerful and the least powerful, but within groups, between men and women, between ethnicities, between regions. Disability was mentioned earlier, and that's an extremely important component as well. That would be a broad brushstroke answer.
Jo, did you want to reflect on that?
I guess one of the beauties of going to visit programs on the ground is that you do see where things really work well and make a fundamental difference to people's quality of life, is where the community has been really engaged and empowered. And they seem like such strange words when you're writing them in stories from Melbourne, but it brings to mind that probably one of the best parables is a little community, the Peace Women of Coop, who are in the Highlands, Central Highlands of PNG, who are the most extraordinary community, who about, I'm trying to remember how long ago, it might have been about 20 years ago, just got so sick of the violence that they endured. Their daughters couldn't go to the river to get water without being abused and raped, and the teachers all ran away because of the violence. This is mostly tribal violence occurring in this area. The teachers left, the health workers left, the bankers left, everything collapsed, and the women just had a gutful. And didn't know what a human right was, but they decided to protest one day, and they snuck around and spoke to each other. They hid in the back of stalls, meeting sisters that they weren't supposed to speak to because they'd married into another Wantok, another clan or tribe. But they got together, and they actually would sneak at night from one community into another as hostages, because if one woman had gone into a community, she would be in great danger, but she would materialise at the same time as her equivalent would show up in her community, and they would say they're basically hostages to one another and hear us out. So these women had this huge protest and plastered themselves with mud and screamed and yelled and sat all the men down and told them what was going on, and their tears for love, they called it, and they said, "We're sick of you killing our children." And one of the chief men stood up and said, "I'm ashamed to wear pants, I want to wear a skirt." And he handed them the power and said, "You start fixing it." And they did. And for a long time, for about the last 15 years, they've made an extraordinary difference. And the teachers came back, the health workers came back, the girls were empowered. When I visited there a year ago, there was this huge celebration because they just set up a community law facility. Unfortunately, I believe it's come unravelled a bit lately, again because of a resources power fight between a couple of groups. But certainly the level of violence that occurred in the past is very much been addressed by this little community, who are now seen as a model perhaps of how to address right from the schoolroom, from the maternal health care, from in this very integrated way, and to bring men into it, but to allow women to lead and to change the kind of paradigms of the society, because the society has so fundamentally changed because of the resources development and all the inequity that's come with that the society has to be assisted to change its way, because in a generation it's not, all the traditional ways have disintegrated and the old protections aren't there. They need to find new ways to protect themselves. So you look at COOP, and I've seen programs like that a dozen times, and it makes a lot of sense of all that ridiculous jargon that you hear sometimes in the development forums.
Deanna, if I can just ask you, just coming off the back of that, both the current UN Secretary-General and the former UN Secretary-General have acknowledged that we can't meet the Millennium Development Goals unless the rights and opportunities of millions of women around the world are transformed. And yet it does appear that we are constantly having to restate that. Why do you think it's been so difficult to get the UN, governments and philanthropic organisations across the line on that reality about the need to pull women out of poverty, and the fact that pulling women out of poverty actually gets you a long way towards wider poverty alleviation?
Yeah. Well, these are long-term processes. You are talking about cultural issues, the political economy of how decisions are made within countries, traditional values and so on, that get sometimes often on the way of giving equal rights to men and women. If you look at the last 20, 30 years, I think that we have made tremendous progress to bring women to greater equality with respect to men. If you look at a region like Latin America, for example, nowadays you have a larger proportion of women in education than men, all the way to tertiary education. And that is great progress. And this is progress that we can see in other countries as well. So we cannot deny the progress that has been made. It has not been enough, that is true, and it needs to be accelerated. And it's part of a longer process of education, of change of cultural values, of change of relations in the society and within families. Nowadays, I think that there is awareness in most regions of the world, in most countries of the world, about the need to accelerate investments and results on women. And we have gone a long way, I think. Not to say that there is not very critical issues like the ones we are discussing now not to say that women are on an equal footing with men, including in developed countries. If you look at wages, wage differentials between women and men, women's wages are systematically lower than men for the equal level of education and equal experience. So this is something that we experience in developed countries as well, you know, as aware as we are of the issues. Things are changing. We need to accelerate that change, but I think that we are heading in a good direction.